After a very progressive speech discussing the more fundamental aspects of our being, we are going to be shifting into a different topic, and Sofia Bulgac from the British School of Bucharest will be giving us a speech on the simplicity of science, where it came from, and where it's going.
Merriam-Webster defines science as knowledge or a system of knowledge covering the general truths or the operation of general laws, especially as obtained and tested through scientific method. That's quite a mouthful. Hi, my name is Sofia, and I'm a student at BSB. As someone who studies science and STEM, the question of what science is and how it's done is very important to me personally. But I'm sure it's also very important to you guys, because you can't take 2 steps out of your door these days without coming across a piece of technology that is so complex you can't even begin to understand it. Scientists have developed methods to simplify this. This is called the scientific method. And for me, that is the standout part of Merriam-Webster's definition. Today I would like to tell you a bit about its history, so that perhaps we may begin to understand where it comes from and why we as humans have felt the need to come up with it. Now, scientific thinking and scientific development has been happening forever, for as long as we have been on this earth and for as long as we have been trying out new things. One of the earliest examples is something called the Edwin Smith Papyrus, which was written in ancient Egypt. This was a medical text that described how you're supposed to diagnose your patients. It said that first, you have to inspect the patient, see what the symptoms are, then come up with a diagnosis, and finally treat the patient and see if it works. You may find this similar to the method that you perhaps learned in school, where you're supposed to come up with a hypothesis, experiment, test it, and then draw conclusions. It's interesting that this method, much like all scientific methods, is based in empiricism, which comes from the Greek word empiria and means to experience. The first thing we do when we try to find knowledge is focus on what we can sense, on the physical aspects of our world. Now, not everybody agreed with this approach in antiquity. The big legends and the big titans of philosophy are the ancient Greeks. We've got Plato, Aristotle, and all their colleagues. They were the first people to actually do organized science the way we recognize it today. They were really preoccupied with finding the basic and fundamental truths of our universe. And they believed in something called the inductive method. This is where you begin with a generalized theory, a big idea, and you try to make it logically sound and say, well, if this makes sense logically, then it should be true in reality, right? Now, that may make sense, but unfortunately, that wasn't always the case. They'd come up with all these grand theories and then find that it was complete nonsense in real life. To give you guys an example so you can understand what I'm talking about, Aristotle defined man as a featherless biped, and the infamous philosopher Diogenes, who lived in a clay jar in Athens and peed on people who insulted him, decided to pluck a chicken and bring it into the council, declaring that this was a man. You can clearly see the issue of this approach. To counter this, Aristotle came up with a method called the inductive-deductive reasoning. This is where you take an observation from the real world, think what could this possibly mean in a theoretical way, and then apply it back to the real world to see if it actually checks out in multiple situations. It's a very simple technique, but one that has been surprisingly effective over the thousands of years that we've been using it. To step forward a bit through history, we can now look at the Middle Ages, specifically in the Islamic Empire. The scientists in the Islamic Empire were very different to those of Greece. They weren't thinkers who just sat in their big marble halls all day theorizing. They were usually artisans. They built instruments, conducted experiments, and had a very hands-on approach. For example, the Arab physicist Ibn al-Haytham, I hope I'm pronouncing that well, did studies in optics, and he wrote a book on optics. His entire work was surrounded and based on lenses and how light behaved in his lab. As time went on, the writings of the Greeks and the Arabs made their way into Europe, and it was used by people who we now call the Enlightenment philosophers. Those of you who are passionate about history or philosophy know that these were the big scientists in Europe. People consider them to be a real explosion of thinking and culture. René Descartes, a French philosopher, had his own theories about the way scientific method should be done. He believed that I think, therefore I am. This simple and often quoted phrase is supposed to sum up his idea that thinking comes first. He believed in theory above practice. Now, the development of science has never been easy, it's never been nice, and there's always been conflict, which is why many of his contemporaries, such as Isaac Newton, argued against him and said, you know what, first, we want to see evidence, and then we'll make theories. Now, I could keep going on all day about all the different people who had an impact on our world today, and all the ways in which we've progressed. But unfortunately, we don't have the time. Instead, I'd like to tie up this speech by telling you a bit about the state of modern science. Now, in the 19th and 20th centuries, science underwent a midlife crisis. There was a debate between two groups of people known as the positivists and post-positivists. Now, the positivists, the traditional scientists, believed that the only sciences out there were the natural sciences, the ones that you can see, feel, smell, taste, and touch. They believed that there was an objective truth, there was an objective knowledge, and if we wanted to find it, we needed to base our methods on fact. But you see, there had been a development in science. There were new sciences being invented that went against this philosophy, such as psychology, sociology. Sciences that rely on the subjective experience, on what you feel, what you think, the way people act, the way two people could describe an argument in different ways. These were known as the post-positivists. Now, this is an ongoing debate, and many of you may have heard of it. Is economics a science, for example? Do we draw the line at biology, chemistry, physics, or do we let the other people into the club? Unfortunately, I don't have an answer for this question because you have to come up with it yourself. The future of science is in your hands. Thank you.